Continuing my look at the Bible verse by verse, and I have now reached Genesis chapter 32. At the end of chapter 31 we read how Laban had followed Jacob and his harem 400 miles from Haran to the modern Jordan-Israel border to try to get his property back. Jacob and Laban then made peace at Galad, probably a spot around 10 miles southeast of the Sea of Galilee. And as chapter 32 begins, having parted from Laban on good terms, Jacob is crossing the Jordan River back into Canaan. What then transpires is another enigmatic story. We begin with an order of battle, a disposition of troops. We see Jacob array his forces, he gets details of Esau's forces, and even God's forces get involved. With battle lines drawn, we are then allowed to share in Jacob's feeling of deep vulnerability. He makes efforts to appease Esau, protect his family, and finally prays for divine assistance. At his most vulnerable, when we might expect him to receive God's reassurance or support, he is instead suddenly attacked and crippled. But this is the turning point in the process which sees the crooked Jacob metamorphosized into the upright Israel. But it is an oddly constructed, or perhaps reconstructed story. From the Bible. And Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's host." And he called the name of that place Mahanaim. Hebrew Mahanaim means two camps, and that is taken by many to mean Jacob's camp and the camp of God's host. Because we're not talking about a couple of angels here, but God's angels. At least a full host of them. Or is there something else going on? The story has Jacob meeting a host of angels and naming the place, but that's it. There's no further mention of this angelic host, which took time out to welcome him home, and as we shall see, there is little evidence that Jacob felt any protection from having a divine army parked next door. Now, if we remember that the Old Testament is telling the story of two kingdoms, Judah and Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, upon the break-up of the United Kingdom of Israel, if it ever existed, will argue their legitimacy as their house of David traces its line back through Judah, Jacob's son, with Leah. Meanwhile, the northern kingdom of Israel will trace its line back through Jacob's son, Joseph, with Rachel. Shortly we will come to the stories of Joseph and Judah, and this separation of Jacob's household into two camps might presage that. If you were recounting a story in oral presentation to an audience brought up knowing the history or legends, then a cue like this might be well placed. Back to the text. So God has told Jacob to return to his home, and here he meets a host of God's angels, so he knows he's not on his own. Jacob now sends messengers off to meet his estranged brother Esau to let him know that he's on his way. His messengers return and tell Jacob that Esau is on his way to meet him with an army of 400 men. Then Jacob was greatly afraid. But why? God had told him to return home, and God had provided an army of angels as an escort. What reason would Jacob have to fear? And why did Esau feel the need to meet him with 400 men? And had Jacob really been with Laban for 20 years and not once thought to find out whether Esau still held a grudge over his fraudulent usurping of birthright? Or sent a message ahead to test the waters? All of these questions and more will not be answered as we continue. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that was with him, and the flocks and herds and the camels, into 2 bands, and said, If Esau come to the one company and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape. So Jacob divides his people into 2 bands. Well, not 2 bands, as in the King James, but literally 2 camps, Makana. We now appear to have 2 explanations available for Jacob naming the place Mahanaim. Is it just possible that this division of his people is the origin of the name Mahanaim, and the story of the host of angels was a later interpolation to show that Jacob was divinely guided? There is a lot of detail in the Jacob story, but a lot of detail missing. We can only guess at the cultural significance of many aspects of the story, or choose to take them as literally true, word by word. Anyway, Jacob had sent his messengers to Esau with the orders, Thus shall ye speak unto my lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob saith thus, I have sojourned with Laban, and stayed there until now, and I have oxen and asses, flocks and men servants and women servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I may find grace in thy sight. Here Jacob is obviously at last expressing subservience to Esau. This is significant, as Jacob, having tricked Isaac into blessing him and passing on the birthright, would have been the master of Esau. So is Jacob perhaps in these verses relinquishing that birthright? Jacob then prays to God in his fear for what might be about to pass. I'm not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast shewed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become 2 bands. Perhaps Jacob has finally discovered some humility in his fear for the future. Again we see the emphasis that I am now become 2 bands, or 2 camps. Back to the text, and Jacob, having prayed, then sends hundreds of sheep and cattle driven to arrive in batches, so that Esau might receive them one after the other and be impressed by the offerings. Having sent off the gifts, Jacob sends his family across the river that he might be left alone, probably to pray. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. There is a huge amount that's been written around these verses, displaying at least the fact that not even the top Hebrew biblical scholars have been able to agree, or perhaps even understand, what is going on here. This is a godsend to the Christian apologists, of course. If you ever wondered where Jesus was for 10 years, between being an obnoxious teenager in the temple and interrupting John the Baptist's swimming lessons, they can tell you. He whizzed back a few centuries in his TARDIS to go 10 rounds with Jacob. I've read several interpretations of this story, but my utter lack of Hebrew does not allow me to add anything to others' observations. There is apparently much wordplay going on around Jacob, the river Jabbok, and the wrestler poking Jacob in the groin. There is a theme of crookedness. God is about to rename Jacob Israel. Jeshurun is the poetic name for Israel used within the Bible and means upright, straight. So perhaps this wrestling match is Jacob wrestling with himself over his divine observances, with the outcome that he would be an upright, monotheistic follower of Yahweh thenceforth. But who won the wrestling match? Verse 25 is full of lowercase he's. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh. It is only when we see the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint that we assume it was the opponent doing the groin poking. But verse 26 has, And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. Who said to who? Is Jacob, out for the count with a dislocated hip, telling the man he won't let him go until he blesses him? And in verse 28, And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Prevailed here is unambiguous, and is strongly suggestive that it was Jacob who won the contest. In verse 30, Jacob then claims that he has seen the face of God and lived, though no one has told him he has, and the early verse clearly states that he was wrestling a man, who, unable to beat him, unfairly dislocates his hip. Not something any all-loving deity would need or want to resort to. Or perhaps, in the original telling, this sudden attack by an unknown assailant, the ambiguous outcome of the fight, and the final reveal was all part of a tension building and release in this little vignette. And of course Jacob Israel feels gratitude that having met God, he survived with nothing worse than being crippled for life. He got off lightly. I will end there, but mention that perhaps a little astrology crept into this story in verse 26. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. A divine who can only play on earth during the hours of darkness? Or perhaps the morning star himself, who must assume his proper place back in the heavens before the day can break? Verse 32. Therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank which is upon the hollow of the thigh, unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew that shrank. Which is as good a reason as any, I suppose. Chapter 33 is just the fond reunion between Jacob, now Israel, and Esau. This is a joyous chapter, full of kind words and charity. A real feel-good moment, which requires little explanation. Of course, what follows immediately after is very much darker. But that must wait for another day. Thanks, as always, for watching.